A fine layer of dust covered the wooden floors of Ridgewood High, softening the echoes of Jason's footsteps as he walked through the front doors. He hadn't set foot in the building since the day he'd graduated over a decade ago. Yet everything felt eerily familiar, the sharp scent of floor polish mixed with the distant memory of sweat from gym classes, the stale air that seemed to have been trapped inside for years. It was as if the building had preserved every sensation, every moment in amber. He clutched the letter in his hand, the edges frayed from the nervous fidgeting he'd subjected it to on the drive over. The letter had been delivered to his apartment, sealed in an envelope with the school's crest stamped in gold. It was an invitation to an alumni event, signed by a name he didn't recognize. The tone of the letter was polite, formal even, but something about it felt off. He couldn't shake the sense that this wasn't just a reunion. The words had lingered in his mind, haunting him until he gave in to the curiosity, or maybe it was nostalgia, that had driven him back to this place. The school looked much the same as it had all those years ago, yet the very sameness of it unsettled him. Time should have worn it down, left its mark in peeling paint, in cracked tiles, in sagging ceilings. But the hallway stretched out before him, unchanged. Only the dust, thick, undisturbed, betrayed the passage of time. He moved forward, the letter still clutched in his hand like a lifeline, his footsteps leaving tracks through the dust, marking his passage through this sepia-toned memory. He passed rows of lockers, their metal doors rusted but firmly closed, as though they still held the secrets and treasures of students long gone. A sense of unease began to creep into the edges of his mind. The silence was too deep, too still, pressing in on him from all sides. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like you were the only person left in the world, but also that you were being watched. Jason shook his head, trying to rid himself of the sensation. It was just an old building, a relic of his past. There was nothing here but memories. Yet the further he ventured, the more those memories began to feel like something more, like echoes of the past that hadn't quite faded, like shadows of events still playing out in some forgotten corner of time. He reached the main corridor, where the trophies from decades of sports victories gleamed under layers of dust. The glass cases were smudged, the gold and silver medals dulled, yet they seemed to stare back at him, accusing, as if they knew something he didn't. A chill ran down his spine, and he almost turned back, but a stubborn part of him urged him on. He approached the doors to the gymnasium, pausing as he placed his hand on the cold metal handle. The invitation had mentioned meeting here first, in the heart of the school where so many of his teenage memories were anchored. For a moment he hesitated, the unease growing into something more tangible, a sense of foreboding that settled heavy in his gut. Nostalgia, he told himself. It's just nostalgia playing tricks on your mind. But even as he thought it, he knew it wasn't true. There was something wrong here, something that had been waiting all these years for someone like him to return. The thought was irrational, but it clung to him like the dust that coated everything in this place, impossible to brush off. Jason took a deep breath, steeling himself, and pushed open the door. The gymnasium lay beyond, shrouded in shadow, its vast emptiness yawning before him. The faint light filtering through the high windows only deepened the gloom, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to shift as he entered. He took a step inside, the door creaking shut behind him with a finality that sent a shiver down his spine. He could feel it now more than ever, an intangible presence, watching him, waiting. The memories, once so comforting, now felt like traps, luring him deeper into a place that wasn't as empty as it seemed. As he stood there, bathed in the twilight of the forgotten gymnasium, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into something far more sinister than an alumni event. This wasn't nostalgia. This was something much darker, something that had been waiting for him all these years, lurking just beneath the surface of the memories he had so naively thought he could revisit. And now there was no turning back. Jason's eyes swept across the corridor, a place where time seemed to have ceased its relentless march. The walls were the same dull beige he remembered, but now they felt oppressive, the color of decay rather than neutrality. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered inconsistently, their hum filling the silence with a low, almost organic sound. It reminded him of the way insects buzz just before a storm, a kind of anticipatory dread that prickled the skin. He moved forward, trying to shake off the growing unease. He told himself it was just nerves, just the natural reaction to being back in a place that had once been such a large part of his life. But the more he walked, the more he noticed how wrong everything felt. It wasn't just the silence, which seemed to absorb his footsteps rather than echo them back. It was the way the air itself seemed thick, almost viscous, as if it were fighting him for every breath. The lockers lining the hall were shut tight, their once vibrant paint dulled by years of neglect. Jason reached out, brushing his fingers along the cold metal. It was a reflex, a habit from the old days when he'd stroll through these halls between classes. But now the metal was coated with a fine layer of grime that clung to his skin like something alive. He wiped his hand on his jeans, but the sensation lingered, an almost oily residue of the past that refused to let go. He passed a classroom, its door slightly ajar. Inside, the desks were still arranged in neat rows, as if waiting for students who would never return. The chalkboard at the front was smeared with half-erased equations, the chalk lying broken and scattered on the floor. He hesitated at the doorway, peering inside, but the shadows seemed to shift, as if the room itself was breathing. A wave of unease washed over him, and he quickly moved on, the corridor feeling more like a tunnel with every step. As he ventured deeper into the school, Jason couldn't shake the sense of being watched. It was an irrational feeling, one that sent a chill down his spine and made him quicken his pace. He turned a corner, and the lights above flickered again, plunging the hallway into momentary darkness. When they flickered back on, it was as if the walls had closed in, the corridor narrowing just a little more than before. He paused, his breath catching in his throat. The rational part of his mind insisted that nothing had changed, that the building was exactly as it had always been, a crumbling relic of his past. But there was another part of him, a part that was growing louder with every passing second, that whispered otherwise. The school felt different, like it had been waiting all these years, like it was holding its breath now that he was back. Jason shook his head, trying to dispel the ridiculous thoughts. It was just an old building. It wasn't alive. It couldn't be. But even as he tried to convince himself, his eyes were drawn to the shadows that pooled in the corners, the places where the light didn't quite reach. They seemed to pulse, as if in sync with the slow, steady beat of his heart. A low creak echoed through the hallway, the sound of something shifting in the distance. Jason froze, his pulse spiking as he strained to listen. The sound came again, closer this time, a groaning noise that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the corridor behind him. But there was nothing there. Just the same dusty lockers, the same peeling paint, the same oppressive silence. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, just out of sight, watching him with eyes that belonged to the darkness itself. The air grew colder, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones and made it hard to think, hard to move. He forced himself to keep walking, each step heavier than the last, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on him. The school that had once been a sanctuary, a place of learning and camaraderie, had become something else entirely. It was a tomb, and he was the intruder, disturbing its long-forgotten rest. Jason swallowed hard, his throat dry as he continued down the hall, feeling as though the very walls were closing in on him. He reached the end of the corridor and pushed open a door, leading to another part of the school. The hinges squealed in protest, the sound almost human in its anguish. As he stepped through, he couldn't help but glance back over his shoulder, half expecting to see something, someone, following him. But there was nothing. Just the empty hallway, stretching out behind him, the darkness swallowing it whole. He let out a shaky breath and moved on, the sense of being watched still clinging to him like a second skin. The school was empty. He was alone. But as the door clicked shut behind him, sealing him deeper inside, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a threshold, one that he might not be able to find his way back from. Jason wasn't sure what he expected to find in the gymnasium, but it certainly wasn't this. The space was cavernous, its walls lined with faded banners proclaiming victories from a time long past. The bleachers loomed like specters in the dim light, their wooden boards creaking as if under the weight of an unseen crowd. The air was thick with the smell of old sweat and dust, the remnants of countless games and assemblies, now nothing more than echoes in the vast, empty space. But he wasn't alone. They stood in clusters across the floor, their backs turned to him, faces focused on each other, engaged in quiet conversation. Jason froze at the threshold, his breath catching in his throat as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. There were perhaps 24 people, dressed in the same out-of-fashion clothes they'd worn the last time he'd seen them, decades ago. Their forms were familiar, but something about them was profoundly wrong, a detail he couldn't quite place. It wasn't until one of them turned towards him that he understood. The face that looked back at him was the same, but the eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, belonged to a stranger. There was no recognition, no spark of life. Just a flat, glassy stare that seemed to look right through him. Jason's heart skipped a beat, his pulse quickening as the sense of unease, which had been building since he'd entered the school, now coiled tight around his chest. "Hey," he called out, his voice hoarse, uncertain. "It's Jason. Jason Collins. Remember." The person, no, the thing that had been one of his old classmates, just stared at him, its mouth twitching in what might have been an attempt at a smile. But the expression was all wrong, too wide, too fixed, like a poorly crafted mask. Jason took a step back, his skin crawling as the other figures began to turn, one by one, towards him. Their faces were all the same, familiar, but devoid of anything human. Each one was locked in an expression of eerie calm, their smiles just a little too perfect, their eyes empty pits that gave nothing away. The conversations between them had stopped, but the silence that followed wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, pressing down on him with the weight of all that wasn't being said. "Jason," one of them finally said, the voice flat, almost mechanical. "It's good to see you again." The words should have been comforting, but they dripped with something cold, something that didn't belong in a simple greeting. Jason swallowed hard, his throat dry as he forced himself to respond. "Yeah, good to see you too," he managed, his voice trembling despite his best efforts. He took another step back, his mind racing. These were his old friends, people he'd spent his teenage years with, but they felt like strangers now. No, worse than strangers. They felt like imposters, mimicking the faces of people long gone. "Come join us," another voice said. This one softer, more insistent. The group began to close in around him, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators sizing up their prey. Jason's skin prickled with a cold sweat as he realized there was no warmth, no camaraderie in their eyes, only a deep, unsettling emptiness. I think I'm just going to look around a bit," Jason stammered, backing away further. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in as the group continued to approach him, their steps eerily synchronized. It was like watching a puppet show where all the strings had been cut, leaving the figures to move in stilted, unnatural ways. "Don't be in such a hurry," the first one said, its voice sounding more like a command than a request. The smile on its face widened, cracking at the edges, as if the skin couldn't quite stretch that far. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, the rhythmic thud echoing in his ears. There was something deeply wrong here, something that went beyond the unsettling familiarity of their faces. It was in the way they moved, the way they spoke, the way they stared at him as if he was the only thing in the room that didn't belong. Without another word, Jason turned on his heel and bolted for the door. He heard the collective intake of breath behind him, a sharp, synchronized sound that sent a spike of fear through his chest. He didn't look back, he couldn't. The terror clawing at his mind told him that if he did, he might see something that would shatter what little sanity he had left. He reached the door and yanked it open, his hands trembling so badly that he almost dropped the handle. As he stepped out into the corridor, he spared one last glance over his shoulder, just in time to see the figures standing in the doorway, watching him with those two wide smiles, their hollow eyes reflecting nothing but the shadows around them. Jason slammed the door shut behind him, the sound echoing through the empty hall. He leaned against it, gasping for breath, his mind reeling. Whatever those things were, they weren't his friends. They weren't even human. And now, more than ever, he realized that this school wasn't just a relic of his past, it was a trap, and he was caught right in the center of it. But the worst part, the part that gnawed at him as he stood there trying to regain his composure, was the dawning realization that maybe, just maybe, those things hadn't been strangers at all. Maybe they were exactly who they appeared to be, only twisted by something dark, something that had been festering in this place for far too long. And whatever it was still watching him, still waiting. Jason's hand was slick with sweat as he tried the door to the main exit, his fingers slipping off the cold metal handle. He yanked harder, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts, but the door didn't budge. It was as if the school itself had sealed him in, locking him away with whatever malevolent force lurked within its walls. He glanced around frantically, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the logic that once governed his world seemed to have unraveled the moment he'd stepped foot inside Ridgewood High. The hallway stretched out before him, its familiar geometry distorted. The once straight lines of lockers now curved subtly, leading the eye in circles that made his head spin if he looked too long. The lights overhead flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Every step he took echoed unnaturally, as though the sound was being swallowed by the walls themselves, twisted and warped beyond recognition. Jason spun around, trying to retrace his steps, but the corridor that had led him here was gone. In its place was another hallway, identical but subtly wrong. The lockers, once a uniform row of rusted blue, were now an undulating sea of dull, lifeless gray. The doors to classrooms were closed tight, their windows covered in a thick layer of grime that obscured whatever might be inside. He was trapped in a place he no longer recognized, a place that seemed to shift and change with each passing second. He tried another door, one that should have led to the cafeteria, but it too was locked tight. He pounded on it, desperation clawing at his chest, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence that had settled over the school. It was the kind of silence that had weight, that pressed down on him like a heavy blanket, muffling his thoughts, suffocating his hope. "This isn't happening," he muttered to himself, his voice trembling as he backed away from the door. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a lie. This was happening. He was trapped, and the school wasn't just a building anymore. It was a maze, an ever-shifting labyrinth designed to keep him inside. Jason's heart hammered in his chest as he turned and ran, his footsteps pounding against the floor in a frantic rhythm. He didn't know where he was going, didn't care, as long as it was away from the growing sense of dread that followed him like a shadow. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, curving in on itself, looping back around in impossible ways. Every turn he took brought him back to where he'd started. The same lockers, the same closed doors, the same suffocating silence. It was as if the building was alive, responding to his movements, shaping itself around him, trapping him in an endless cycle of fear. He could feel it now, in the way the walls seemed to pulse with a faint, rhythmic throb, like the heartbeat of some unseen, malevolent entity. The air grew colder, the kind of cold that bit deep into his skin, that settled in his bones and made them ache. His breath fogged in front of him, each exhale a reminder of how real this nightmare had become. He stumbled to a stop, his lungs burning, his legs trembling with exhaustion. The corridor stretched out before him, an unending tunnel of despair that seemed to mock his every effort to escape. His mind was spinning, frayed at the edges, unraveling just as the reality around him had. He had to think, had to figure out what was happening, but every thought slipped through his fingers like sand, impossible to grasp. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement, a flicker of shadow that darted across the hallway, just beyond the reach of the flickering lights. Jason froze, his breath catching in his throat as he strained to see what it was. But there was nothing there, just the shifting shadows, playing tricks on his mind, feeding the growing terror that gnawed at his sanity. But was it really a trick, or was it something more? Something that had been waiting all this time, lurking just out of sight, waiting for him to break. Jason shook his head, trying to dispel the thought, but it clung to him, burrowing deep into his mind. He had to get out. He had to find a way out. The exit had to be here, somewhere, hidden in the maze of corridors and shifting shadows. But where? He turned again, his legs trembling as he forced them to move, and started down another hallway. The walls seemed to close in on him, the space narrowing with each step, until he was sure he would be crushed between them. His heart raced, pounding against his ribs, the sound of it filling his ears, drowning out everything else. Then, in the distance, he saw it, a door, standing slightly ajar, a faint sliver of light spilling out from the crack. It was the first sign of hope he'd seen since this nightmare had begun, and he latched onto it, pushing himself forward, driven by a desperate need to escape. He reached the door and shoved it open, stumbling inside. The light was blinding, harsh after the dimness of the hallways, and it took him a moment to adjust. When he did, he found himself in another corridor, identical to the one he'd just left. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing through the empty hallway, sealing him inside. Jason's breath hitched as the realization set in. The school wasn't just locking him in, it was leading him, guiding him deeper into its twisted heart, and with each step, each turn, he was getting closer to whatever it was that waited for him at the center. But there was no other choice. He had to keep moving. He had to find a way out before the school found a way to break him entirely. With a shaky breath, Jason started down the corridor, the door behind him disappearing into the darkness, just another piece of the maze that held him captive. The school was alive, and it wanted him to know that there was no escape, no way out but through. And whatever waited at the end of the labyrinth, Jason was sure of one thing: it was hungry. Jason's breath echoed in the silence, each inhalation a raspy reminder of the fear that had settled deep in his chest. The hallways had become a twisted maze, warping and shifting with each step, and the school's oppressive silence had begun to play tricks on his mind. But now, as he stood before yet another darkened corridor, something new crept into the silence, a low, barely perceptible whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. He froze, straining to listen, his ears picking up on the ghostly murmur that floated through the still air. The words were indistinct, like the fragments of a forgotten conversation carried on a distant breeze, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the sound of fear, of something ancient and malevolent hiding just out of sight. The whispers ebbed and flowed, growing louder as he approached, then fading to nothing when he tried to pinpoint their source. Jason's pulse quickened as he pressed on, the whispers guiding him, pulling him deeper into the school's darkened heart. The corridor narrowed around him, the walls closing in until he had to turn sideways to pass through, his shoulder brushing against the cold, rough surface. The air grew stale, heavy with the scent of mold and decay, and his skin prickled with a cold sweat as he continued forward. Then, in the dim light ahead, he saw them, figures moving in the shadows, their outlines hazy, almost insubstantial. Jason hesitated, a shiver running down his spine as he watched the shapes drift through the hallway. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, their motions jerky and repetitive, as if caught in an endless loop. He could hear them now, their whispers merging into a single, continuous drone that filled his ears, drowning out his thoughts. He took a step closer, his heart pounding as the figures came into clearer view, They were students, no, not students, but pale imitations of them. Their faces were gaunt, their skin a sickly gray, their eyes vacant and lifeless. They wore the tattered remnants of school uniforms, the fabric worn thin and faded, hanging loosely on their emaciated frames. They moved without purpose, their hands and feet shuffling in an eerie rhythm, repeating the same gestures over and over, as if trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was seeing. These were the students who had been lost to the school, the ones who had never made it out. But they weren't alive, at least not in any way he understood. They were phantoms, trapped in a time and place that no longer existed, forced to relive the same moments over and over, their souls bound to the school's twisted will. One of the figures paused, its head slowly turning toward Jason, as if sensing his presence. He locked eyes with it, and for a brief moment he saw something flicker in the depths of its empty gaze, something dark and hungry, something that recognized him as more than just another ghost in the machine. The figure began to move toward him, its steps slow but deliberate, the others following suit, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. Jason's muscles tensed as he fought the urge to run, knowing that if he did, they would only pursue him with a relentless determination. He could feel their eyes on him now, dozens of hollow gazes fixed on his every move, their voices merging into a single, mournful chant that echoed through the hallway. Stay with us. The words seeped into his mind like a poison, a siren call that tugged at his resolve, urging him to give in, to let go. Jason shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts, but the chant only grew louder, more insistent, as the phantoms closed in around him. Stay with us. The figure at the front of the group reached out, its hand a skeletal claw, the flesh stretched tight over brittle bones. Jason stumbled back, his foot catching on a loose tile, sending him crashing to the floor. The impact jolted through him, pain flaring in his knee, but the fear that gripped his heart was far worse. He scrambled backward, his palms scraping against the rough floor, as the phantoms continued their slow, deliberate advance. Stay with us. The words were all he could hear now, drowning out everything else, suffocating him with their cold, desperate plea. He could feel them pulling at him, not just physically but mentally, their voices worming their way into his thoughts, filling his mind with images of endless halls and darkened classrooms, of a life spent wandering these corridors, lost and forgotten. No, Jason shouted, the sound raw and ragged in his throat. He forced himself to his feet, his legs trembling, his vision blurring as he fought against the pull of the phantom's chant. He had to get out. He had to find a way out before the school consumed him, before he became one of them. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the hallway, the whispers chasing him, nipping at his heels like a pack of ravenous wolves. The corridor twisted and turned, the walls seeming to close in around him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The phantoms' voices filled his ears, their cries of stay, growing fainter with each step, but the fear that had taken root in his heart remained, urging him onward. Jason didn't know how long he ran, didn't care. All he knew was that he had to keep moving, had to put as much distance between himself and those things as possible. He rounded a corner and burst into another hallway, this one mercifully empty, the whispers finally fading into silence. He leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence that followed was deafening, a void that threatened to swallow him whole. But he didn't care. For now, at least he was safe. But as he stood there, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear, he knew that it wasn't over. The school wasn't done with him yet. And somewhere, in the depths of its twisted halls, the phantoms were still waiting, still whispering their terrible, mournful chant, ready to claim him as one of their own. He was running out of time. And deep down, Jason knew that if he didn't find a way out soon, he would be lost to this place forever. The corridor stretched on before Jason, a tunnel of darkness broken only by the occasional flicker of a dying fluorescent light. His footsteps, once frantic and loud, had slowed to a cautious shuffle. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence: the creak of a loose floorboard, the distant groan of the building settling, the uneven rhythm of his breathing. The terror that had driven him to run was now a heavy weight in his chest, pressing down on him with every step. As he moved deeper into the school, the oppressive atmosphere grew thicker, the air itself seeming to cling to his skin like a cold, wet cloth. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the edge of his vision, waiting for him to make a wrong move. The whispers from earlier had faded, but their absence was no comfort. It only made the silence more unbearable, more suffocating. Jason rounded a corner and stopped dead in his tracks. Before him, the hallway ended in a large, heavy door, its wood darkened with age and wear. A brass plaque was mounted beside it, the letters tarnished but still legible: Room 203, History. His heart skipped a beat as he stared at the door. It shouldn't be here. Room 203 was on the second floor, at the far end of the east wing. Yet here it was, standing before him in a place it had no business being. The irrationality of it, the impossibility, sent a fresh wave of dread washing over him. But there was something else too, something darker. He could feel a pull, a compulsion that urged him forward, a silent command that he couldn't ignore. His hand moved of its own accord, reaching for the door handle. It was cold to the touch, so cold that it sent a sharp pain shooting up his arm, but he didn't let go. He couldn't. With a deep breath, he twisted the handle and pushed the door open. The room beyond was bathed in a dim, amber light, the kind that comes just before the sun dips below the horizon. Desks were arranged in neat rows, each one occupied by a student, their heads bowed, their eyes fixed on the open books in front of them. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and chalk dust, mingled with something else, something sweet and cloying that made Jason's stomach turn. As he stepped inside, the door swung shut behind him with a soft click, sealing him in. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn and leave, but his feet carried him forward, down the narrow aisle between the rows of desks. The students didn't look up as he passed, their faces hidden behind the curtains of hair that fell across their foreheads. They were unnervingly still, their bodies rigid, their hands unmoving on the pages of their books. At the front of the room, the teacher's desk stood empty, the blackboard behind it covered in a series of unintelligible scrawls. Jason squinted, trying to make sense of the writing, but the words seemed to shift and blur the harder he looked at them, like shadows dancing just out of reach. His steps slowed as he approached the desk, his eyes drawn to a single figure seated in the front row. Unlike the others, this student was slumped over the desk, their hand hanging limply over the side, a pencil clutched loosely between their fingers. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the figure. It was the same student he had seen in the hallway, the one who had reached out to him, their hollow eyes filled with a terrible, desperate hunger. A soft, rustling sound filled the room, and Jason turned to find the rest of the students shifting in their seats, their heads lifting slowly, their movements mechanical, as if they were marionettes pulled by invisible strings. They turned toward him in unison, their faces still hidden, their eyes locked on him through the dark veil of their hair. "Sit down," a voice said, soft but commanding. Jason's legs moved without his permission, carrying him to an empty desk in the middle of the room. He sat down, his body rigid, his mind screaming in protest, but his muscles refused to obey. It was as if the very air in the room had become an unseen force, pressing down on him, compelling him to stay. The voice spoke again, and this time Jason could make out the source. At the front of the room, the figure of the teacher had appeared, standing tall and imposing behind the desk. They were shrouded in shadow, their features indistinct, but their presence was undeniable. The students remained motionless, their eyes fixed on Jason, waiting. "The lesson is about to begin," the teacher said, their voice low and melodic, with an undercurrent of something sharp and dangerous. The sound of it sent a shiver down Jason's spine, and he clenched his hands into fists, his knuckles turning white. The teacher began to speak, their voice filling the room, drowning out the sound of Jason's rapid heartbeat. The words were incomprehensible, a string of syllables that made no sense, but they seemed to resonate with the students. Their heads nodded in unison, their hands moving in perfect synchronization as they turned the pages of their books, following along with the lesson. Jason tried to stand, to move, but his body remained frozen in place. He could feel the weight of the teacher's gaze on him, even though he couldn't see their eyes, and it was all he could do to keep his breathing steady. "Pay attention," the teacher's voice whispered, though their lips hadn't moved. "You don't want to miss this." The room began to close in around him, the walls creeping closer, the ceiling lowering, the space shrinking until it was suffocating. Jason's vision blurred, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker, deeper, until they were a solid black mass that pressed in on him from all sides. The students began to chant, their voices merging with the teacher's words, forming a low, droning hum that vibrated through Jason's skull. The sound was unbearable, a relentless, rhythmic pounding that matched the frantic beat of his heart. He could feel it now, a pressure building behind his eyes, a sharp, stabbing pain that threatened to split his head open. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but it only grew louder, more insistent, until it was all he could hear, all he could think about. The teacher's voice wove through the chant, a thread of darkness that twisted and coiled in his mind, wrapping around his thoughts, suffocating them, crushing them into nothing. Jason's hands clenched the edge of the desk, his knuckles white with the effort, but he couldn't move, couldn't escape the voice that was burrowing into his brain, rewriting everything he knew, everything he was. The lesson had begun, and there was no way out. The air in the classroom was thick with tension, the kind that crawled beneath your skin and set your nerves on edge. Jason sat frozen in his desk, the droning hum of the students' chant still reverberating in his skull. The shadows in the room had deepened, pressing in from all sides, and the teacher, if that's what the figure at the front of the room could be called, loomed larger, their presence filling the space with a palpable malevolence. "You have forgotten," the teacher intoned, their voice a low, resonant whisper that seemed to bypass Jason's ears and burrow straight into his mind. "But we will remind you. We will teach you." Jason's thoughts scrambled for purchase, but they slipped away, fragmented by the oppressive force that was closing in on him from every direction. The other students, their faces still hidden behind veils of dark hair, turned their hollow eyes toward him, their expressions vacant, but their intent unmistakable. They were focused on him now, their chant shifting into a steady rhythm, punctuated by sharp, guttural sounds that made his skin crawl. The teacher moved closer, their forms still indistinct, cloaked in shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse with a life of their own. Jason felt a pressure building in his chest, a weight that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. The droning chant grew louder, a relentless pounding that matched the rhythm of his own heartbeat, forcing him into sync with the voices that surrounded him. "You will learn," the teacher whispered, their voice like a cold wind that cut through his defenses, chilling him to the bone. "You will remember." A flash of pain lanced through Jason's skull, and he gasped, clutching his head as memories that weren't his own flooded his mind. Images of the school, bright and pristine, filled with students and teachers, laughter echoing through the halls. But the images twisted, darkened, students trapped in endless loops of time, their faces contorted in expressions of horror and despair, their voices lost in the void as they cried out for help that would never come. Jason tried to fight it, to push the images away, but they kept coming, each one more vivid, more horrifying than the last. He saw the students before him, saw them as they were before they had been taken by the school, before they had been consumed by whatever dark force held sway here. They had been like him once, full of life and hope, but now they were empty vessels, their souls stripped away, leaving only shells behind. He saw himself in their place, saw the shadows closing in, saw the school wrapping its tendrils around his mind, sinking deeper, deeper, until there was nothing left of him. He would become one of them, just another lost soul trapped in this hell, doomed to repeat the same actions, the same lessons, over and over for eternity. No, the word tore from his throat, raw and desperate, but it barely made a dent in the oppressive weight bearing down on him. The teacher's shadowed form loomed closer, and he could feel their presence now, like icy fingers wrapping around his mind, tightening their grip. "You will remember." The teacher whispered again, their voice filling his head, drowning out everything else. The pain intensified, a searing agony that made him want to scream, to tear his own thoughts apart just to make it stop. But he couldn't move, couldn't escape the grip that was crushing him from the inside out. The memories, the lessons, continued to flood his mind, each one a jolt of pain that left him gasping for breath. He saw the school as it had been, saw the darkness creeping in at the edges, saw the students and teachers falling one by one, their minds consumed, their bodies trapped in an endless cycle of torment. And he saw the thing at the center of it all, the dark force that had taken root in the heart of the school, feeding on the fear, the despair, the hopelessness of those it had claimed. It was a hunger that could never be sated, a void that consumed everything it touched. And now it wanted him. Jason's vision blurred, his thoughts unraveling as the pain reached a crescendo. He was losing himself, being pulled apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the darkness. The chant of the students had become a roar, a cacophony that echoed inside his skull, threatening to split it open. And then, just when he thought he couldn't take any more, when he was on the verge of giving in, of letting the darkness swallow him whole, a spark of defiance flared within him. It was small, almost insignificant against the overwhelming tide of despair, but it was enough. "No," he whispered again, the word barely more than a breath, but it was enough to break the rhythm, to disrupt the flow of the chant. He clung to that spark, fanning it into a flame, a lifeline in the midst of the storm. "No," he repeated, louder this time, his voice trembling but steady. The pain was still there, gnawing at the edges of his mind, but he held on to that defiance, that refusal to be consumed. The teacher paused, their shadowed forms seeming to waver, as if they were taken aback by his resistance. The chant faltered, the students' voices growing fainter, less certain. Jason could feel the grip on his mind loosening, the pressure easing just enough for him to draw a full breath. He pushed back with everything he had, focusing on that spark of defiance, forcing the darkness to retreat. The images in his mind began to fade, the pain lessening with each passing second, until he was left standing on the edge of the void, battered and bruised, but still himself. The teacher's form flickered, the shadows retreating slightly, but their voice was still there, a whisper in the back of his mind, insidious and persistent. "You will learn," they said, but there was something else there now, a hint of uncertainty, of doubt. Jason shook his head, his vision clearing, the oppressive weight lifting as he regained control of his thoughts. He wasn't out of danger, not by a long shot, but he had made a crack in the darkness, and that was enough for now. "No," he said, his voice firm, resolute. "I won't." The teacher's form wavered again, the shadows around them flickering as if caught in a strong wind. The students remained silent, their heads bowed once more, their chant silenced. Jason stood slowly, his body aching, his mind still reeling from the assault. But he was no longer paralyzed by fear. He had faced the darkness, had seen what it wanted from him, and had refused. The teacher's shadowy form seemed to shrink, to retreat, and for the first time since he had entered the room, Jason felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him moving, to keep him fighting. He took a step forward, toward the door at the back of the classroom, and the shadows parted before him, grudgingly giving way. The teacher said nothing, their presence still lingering, but Jason knew he had won this round. As he reached the door, he paused, glancing back at the students still seated at their desks, their faces hidden, their bodies unnaturally still. He didn't know if he could save them, didn't know if they could be saved, but he couldn't stay here any longer. He had to keep moving, had to find a way out before the school claimed him completely. With a final, determined breath, Jason pushed open the door and stepped through, leaving the classroom and its horrors behind. But as the door swung shut behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that the lesson wasn't over, that it had only just begun. The door slammed shut behind Jason with a heavy thud, the sound echoing through the empty corridor like the closing of a tomb. He didn't dare look back. He could still feel the oppressive weight of the classroom's malevolent presence pressing down on him, even though he had left it behind. The memory of the teacher's voice, that insidious whisper, still lingered in the back of his mind, a shadow that refused to be shaken off. He started running. The hallway stretched out before him, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, the sickly yellow light flickering, as if struggling to stay lit. The air was thick and heavy, suffused with the acrid smell of decay, and something far worse, fear, palpable and pervasive, hanging in the air like a toxic fog. Jason's breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed himself forward, his footsteps echoing hollowly against the tiled floor. Every turn he took led him deeper into the labyrinthine bowels of the school, the corridors looping back on themselves in impossible ways. The layout of the building no longer made any sense, stairs leading down where they should lead up, hallways that ended in blank walls only to open up into new passageways when he blinked. He was trapped in a nightmare, and the school itself was the monster, reshaping itself to keep him lost and disoriented. Jason's pulse pounded in his ears, his thoughts a frantic jumble as he tried to navigate the shifting maze. He could feel the school's malevolent presence growing stronger, as if it had become aware of his every move, every breath. The walls seemed to close in on him, the space narrowing until he could barely squeeze through. He could hear the whispers again, faint and distant at first, but growing louder, more insistent, as if the phantoms of the students were chasing him, their voices a relentless tide that threatened to drag him under. He turned a corner and found himself face to face with a dead end, a wall that hadn't been there moments before. Panic surged through him, sharp and electric, as he spun around, only to see the hallway behind him had shifted too, the way he had come now blocked by another featureless wall. The school was toying with him, playing a cruel game that had no exit, no escape. "No," Jason muttered to himself, his voice trembling as he pressed his back against the cold, unyielding surface of the wall. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But the pounding of his heart, the burn in his lungs, the cold sweat running down his spine, they all told him otherwise. This was real, and the school was very much alive, its hunger a dark, all-consuming force that sought to devour him, just as it had devoured those before him. Jason clenched his fists, forcing himself to breathe, to think. He couldn't let the fear take over, couldn't let it paralyze him. He had to find a way out. There had to be a way out. The whispers grew louder, closer, and Jason could hear the words now, disjointed and garbled, but filled with a terrible urgency. Run. No escape. Lost. Forever, the voices overlapped, merging into a single, droning hum that reverberated in his skull, threatening to split his mind apart. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head as if he could dislodge the voices, but they only grew more intense, more insistent. His hands fumbled along the wall, searching for any crack, any seam, any way out, but the surface was smooth and unyielding, trapping him in a box of his own fear. Run. 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 The command came from deep within, a primal instinct that overrode the panic, the terror, and Jason pushed off the wall, bolting down the narrow corridor that had appeared to his left. He didn't think, didn't hesitate, just ran, his legs pumping furiously as the walls seemed to ripple and bend around him, the hallway warping in impossible ways. The floor tilted under his feet, as if the entire building was shifting, trying to throw him off balance, but he kept running, driven by the sheer need to survive. The lights overhead flickered faster, the shadows deepening, stretching out like claws that reached for him, trying to drag him back into the darkness. He could feel the air thickening, pressing against his chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to think, but he pushed through, refusing to slow down. He rounded another corner, and the hallway suddenly opened up into a vast, empty space, the ceiling arching high above him like the vaulted roof of a cathedral. The walls were lined with towering bookshelves, their shelves sagging under the weight of countless tomes, their spines cracked and worn. It was the library, a place he hadn't seen since he first entered the school, but now it was a cavernous void, the once familiar space twisted and corrupted. Jason skidded to a halt, his chest heaving as he took in the sight. The whispers were still there, but they had changed, becoming deeper, darker, as if the very books themselves were speaking, their words woven into the fabric of the school's malevolent will. He spun around, searching for another exit, but the door he had entered through was gone, replaced by yet another wall. The room felt alive, the shelves looming over him like the ribs of a great beast, the books whispering secrets he couldn't understand but felt deep in his bones. His eyes darted around the room, searching for any way out, any hint of escape, but all he could see were the rows upon rows of books, their pages fluttering, as if caught in a breeze that didn't exist. The air was thick with the smell of must and rot, the scent of forgotten knowledge and decayed memories. Jason took a tentative step forward, and the floor beneath him creaked ominously, the sound reverberating through the room, like the groan of a dying animal. He froze, his breath catching in his throat as the floorboards began to shift, the wood buckling and splintering as if something was moving beneath them, something massive and hungry. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and Jason felt a deep, primal fear grip him, a terror that went beyond the rational, beyond the physical. He could feel it now, the presence that had been stalking him, hunting him through the school's twisted halls, a presence that was ancient and powerful, a force that had no name, no form, but was all-encompassing. He took another step back, and the floor cracked beneath him. A jagged fissure splitting the wood as something dark and writhing began to seep through, like tendrils of smoke or shadow. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, his body trembling as the darkness began to spread, crawling up the walls, engulfing the shelves, consuming the books and their whispers in a tide of black nothingness. There was no escape. The school had him now, and it wasn't going to let go. "No," Jason shouted, the word a raw, desperate cry that echoed through the cavernous space. He turned and ran again, his feet pounding against the unstable floor as the darkness surged after him, hungry and relentless. The shelves blurred past him, the books a whirlwind of forgotten knowledge, but he didn't stop, didn't look back. He could feel the darkness closing in, the whispers now a deafening roar that filled his mind, threatening to overwhelm him, to pull him under. His legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he kept running, driven by sheer terror, by the knowledge that if he stopped, if he hesitated for even a second, the school would claim him, body and soul. The floor beneath him buckled, and Jason stumbled, nearly falling as the darkness surged forward, but he caught himself, pushing off with a burst of adrenaline that sent him careening toward the far end of the room. He could see a door there, faint and flickering, like a mirage in the desert, but it was his only hope, his only chance. The darkness was almost upon him now, its cold, suffocating presence pressing against his back, reaching for him with tendrils of black smoke. Jason lunged forward, his hand outstretched, fingers grasping for the door handle, as the floor beneath him gave way, the wood splintering into 1,000 pieces. He grabbed the handle and yanked the door open, throwing himself through just as the darkness surged forward, crashing into the door with a force that shook the walls. Jason slammed the door shut behind him, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he leaned against it, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The whispers were gone, the darkness held at bay, but he knew it wasn't over. The school was still alive, still hunting him, and the next time he might not be so lucky. But for now, he was safe. For now. The door closed behind Jason with a heavy, final click, sealing him into the new room. His breath came in shallow gasps, his chest heaving as he tried to steady himself, to pull his thoughts back from the edge of panic. The air here was different, thicker, denser, as if it had been trapped in the room for years, stagnant and sour. The smell of mildew and rot was overwhelming, clinging to the back of his throat, making it hard to breathe. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, Jason realized where he was. The walls were lined with wooden desks, each one covered in a thick layer of dust, the surfaces scarred and gouged from years of abuse. The chalkboard at the front of the room was smeared with ancient, half-erased writing, the words barely legible under the grime. A broken clock hung crookedly above it, its hands frozen at some forgotten hour. This was the detention room, a place that had always carried an air of dread even when the school was still alive with students. It was where you were sent when you'd crossed a line, when the regular punishments weren't enough. But now, in the silence of the abandoned school, the room had taken on a much darker, more sinister aspect. Jason stepped forward cautiously, his footsteps muted by the thick layer of dust that coated the floor. The air was still, unnervingly so, the kind of stillness that made every sound seem louder, more significant. He could hear his own heartbeat, the blood rushing in his ears, the creak of the old wood under his feet. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to get out of this room, but he knew there was no going back. The darkness in the library had seen to that. He approached one of the desks, peering down at the surface. The name Evan was scratched deeply into the wood, surrounded by angry, jagged lines, as if the person who'd made them had been in the grip of some terrible emotion. Jason reached out, brushing the dust away, revealing more names, more scratches, each one telling a silent story of frustration, anger, fear. These weren't just the marks of bored or rebellious students, they were the desperate attempts of trapped souls to leave some part of themselves behind, to assert their existence in a place designed to erase them. A soft, rhythmic scratching sound broke the silence, and Jason jerked his head up, his heart skipping a beat. The sound was faint, almost inaudible, but in the stillness of the room, it might as well have been a gunshot. He strained his ears, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sound seemed to come from all around him, as if the walls themselves were alive with it. He took another step forward, his breath catching in his throat as the scratching grew louder, more frantic. His eyes darted around the room, scanning the rows of desks, the chalkboard, the empty chair behind the teacher's desk, but nothing moved. The room was as still and lifeless as it had been when he entered, yet the sound persisted, growing more insistent with each passing second. Jason's gaze fell on the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to cling more thickly, refusing to be dispelled by the weak light from the flickering bulb overhead. There, crouched in the corner, was a figure, small, hunched over, its back to him. The scratching was coming from it, the sound of something sharp dragged over wood, repeated in a ceaseless, maddening rhythm. He approached slowly, each step an exercise in willpower as the air grew colder, the smell of rot stronger. The figure didn't move, didn't react to his presence. It just kept scratching, its hand moving in tight, mechanical circles over the surface of the desk. As he drew closer, Jason could make out more details, thin, gaunt arms, fingers stained dark with something that wasn't quite ink. The hair was matted and filthy, hanging in greasy strands that obscured the face. "Hey," Jason said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he were afraid of waking something much worse than this pathetic creature. "Are you Are you okay?" The scratching stopped abruptly, the silence that followed almost unbearable in its suddenness. The figure froze, its hand hovering just above the desk, the tension in the room thick enough to choke on. For a long moment, nothing happened, and Jason felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't what he feared it was. But then the figure turned. The face that looked up at him was a mask of horror, a twisted caricature of a human being. The eyes were wide and vacant, their whites streaked with red, as if they had been staring at something too terrible to comprehend for far too long. The mouth was twisted into a grotesque grimace, the lips cracked and bleeding, as if they had been chewed to pieces from the inside. And the hand that had been scratching at the desk, was nothing but bone, the flesh peeled away in strips, revealing the stark white beneath, the tendon still twitching, as if trying to complete the task it had been assigned. Jason stumbled back, his stomach lurching as the figure lurched forward, its empty eyes locked onto him, its mouth opening and closing in a silent scream. The scratching sound started again, louder this time, more frantic, and Jason realized with dawning horror that it wasn't coming from the figure in front of him. It was coming from all around him, from the desks, from the walls, from the floor itself. He spun around, and his blood ran cold. The other desks, each one now occupied by a similar figure, each one hunched over, each one scratching at the surface with skeletal hands. The room was alive with the sound, a cacophony of desperate, mindless repetition, the rhythm pounding in his head, driving him to the edge of sanity. "Get out," a voice whispered, but it wasn't his own. It was everywhere, in the air, in the walls, in the frantic, incessant scratching. "Get out before you join us." Jason didn't need to be told twice. He bolted for the door, his feet slipping on the dust-covered floor, the figures at the desks turning to watch him as he ran, their eyes empty, their hands never ceasing in their terrible, endless task. He grabbed the door handle and yanked it open, the door protesting with a loud creak, but it gave way, spilling him out into the hallway beyond. The door slammed shut behind him, cutting off the sound of the scratching, but not the memory of it, not the image of those hollow, soulless faces, their hands reduced to bone, trapped in a cycle of torment with no end in sight. Jason leaned against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart hammering in his chest. The school wasn't just a trap, it was a prison, a place where time and sanity had no meaning, where the lost were condemned to repeat the same actions over and over until there was nothing left of them. And he had almost joined them. He pushed off the wall, his legs trembling but still capable of holding him up, and started down the hallway, away from the detention room, away from the sound of scratching that still echoed in his mind. He had to keep moving. He had to find a way out. Because if he didn't, he knew what awaited him. And he wasn't ready to join them. Not yet. Jason's legs carried him down the dimly lit hallway, but his mind was a whirlpool of dread. Every step he took seemed heavier than the last, each footfall reverberating through the empty corridors of the school like the tolling of a distant bell. The cold, oppressive air pressed against his skin, making it difficult to breathe, as if the very walls were closing in on him, eager to swallow him whole. He tried to push the images of the detention room from his mind, but they clung to him like a second skin, the gaunt, skeletal figures, their dead eyes, the ceaseless scratching. It was a nightmare he couldn't wake from, a descent into madness where reality twisted and broke, leaving him stranded in a world that no longer made any sense. Jason rounded a corner, and the hallway opened up into another large room. He froze at the threshold, his breath catching in his throat as he took in the sight before him. It was a classroom, much like the others he had seen, but this one was different, much worse. At first glance, it seemed almost normal, the rows of desks lined up in perfect symmetry, the chalkboard at the front covered in neat, precise writing. But the longer he looked, the more the details stood out, each one more horrifying than the last. The desks were not empty. Each one held a student, their bodies unnaturally still, their heads bowed as if in deep concentration. But these students were not like the others he had seen. These students were alive, or at least they had been. The first thing that struck Jason was the smell, a sickly, sweet odor that filled the room, mingling with the stench of decay. It was the smell of rot, of flesh that had begun to decompose even as it clung stubbornly to life. The students' bodies were twisted, contorted in ways that should have been impossible, their limbs elongated and misshapen, their skin pulled taut over protruding bones. They were like grotesque marionettes, their strings yanked too tight by some cruel, unseen hand. But it was their faces that made Jason's blood run cold. Their eyes were wide open, staring blankly ahead, unblinking, unseeing, yet somehow still aware. Their mouths were stretched into rictus grins, the corners pulled back so far that the skin had split, revealing teeth that had grown long and jagged, more like the fangs of a predator than anything human. And in the center of each forehead, just above the eyes, was a deep, circular indentation, as if something had been driven into their skulls. Jason's stomach churned, and he had to fight back the urge to vomit as he took a step forward, his gaze locked on the nearest student. The boy, No, the thing that had once been a boy, was scribbling furiously in a notebook, the pencil moving so fast that it was nothing but a blur. The sound of it, scratch, 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 was like nails on a chalkboard, a maddening rhythm that seemed to sync with the rapid, erratic beating of Jason's heart. He moved closer, his feet dragging against the floor, as if the very air in the room was trying to hold him back. The closer he got, the more he could see the details, the way the boy's hand was a twisted claw. The fingers fused together in a grotesque parody of a human hand. The pencil was jammed into the flesh, embedded deep in the muscle, and it moved not with the boy's will, but as if driven by some other force, some malevolent power that had taken control of his body. Jason tore his eyes away from the boy and looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over the other students. Each one was the same, trapped in the same horrific state, their bodies locked in an endless cycle of movement, their minds long since broken by the torture they were forced to endure. And at the front of the room, watching over them with a cold, calculating gaze, was the teacher. The teacher was different from the shadowy figure Jason had encountered before. This one was fully visible, standing tall and straight behind the desk, their face a mask of calm authority. But there was nothing human about them. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, with veins pulsing just beneath the surface like dark, twisting roots. Their eyes were black voids, devoid of any emotion, any warmth. And their mouth, oh God, their mouth was a thin line, stretched so tightly across their face that it seemed ready to split open at any moment. The teacher's gaze locked onto Jason the moment he entered the room, and a twisted smile curled at the edges of that too thin mouth. There was a flicker of recognition in those black eyes, as if the teacher had been expecting him, had been waiting for him all along. "Ah, another student," the teacher said, their voice smooth, almost soothing, but with an undercurrent of something dark and predatory. "You're just in time for the lesson." Jason's blood ran cold, and he took an involuntary step back, his heart hammering in his chest. The teacher's smile widened, and they gestured to an empty desk at the front of the room, the only one not occupied by one of the grotesque figures. "Please, take a seat," the teacher said, their voice silky and insistent. "It's time to learn." Jason's legs refused to move, his body frozen in place as the teacher's words wrapped around his mind like a vice, squeezing tighter with each passing second. He could feel it now, the same force that had taken hold of the other students, the same dark power that had twisted their bodies and minds, trying to worm its way into him, trying to break him. "No," he whispered, his voice shaking, barely audible. "I won't." The teacher's smile faltered, just for a moment, but then it returned, colder and sharper than before. They took a step forward, their movements smooth and fluid, as if they were gliding across the floor, rather than walking. "You will," the teacher said, their voice low and commanding, the words hitting Jason like a physical blow. "You have no choice." The students around him began to stir, their movements slow and jerky at first, but then more deliberate, more purposeful. Their heads turned toward him, their blank eyes locking onto his, and the room was suddenly filled with a low, droning hum, the sound of dozens of voices speaking in unison, repeating the same word over and over. "Learn, learn, learn." Jason clamped his hands over his ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. It was inside his head, vibrating through his skull, filling every corner of his mind with that single terrible command. Learn. 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 The teacher's eyes gleamed with dark satisfaction as they watched him struggle, their smile stretching even wider, almost impossibly so. They gestured to the empty desk again, more forcefully this time, and Jason felt his legs buckle, the urge to obey, to sit down, to give in, overwhelming him. "No," he shouted, the word tearing from his throat, raw and desperate. The teacher's expression darkened, and the room seemed to grow colder, the walls closing in, the light dimming until it was nothing but a faint, sickly glow. The student's chant grew louder, more insistent, the words drilling into his brain like knives, cutting away at his will, his resolve. Learn. 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 Jason staggered backward, his vision swimming, the room spinning around him. He could feel himself slipping, losing control, as the darkness closed in, as the voices grew louder, as the teacher's presence loomed larger and larger, filling his entire world. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, a glimmer of light, faint but steady, coming from the far corner of the room. He turned, his gaze locking onto the source, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a student, just like the others, but different. This one was smaller, younger, their body less twisted, less corrupted. They were sitting at their desk, just like the others, but their eyes, they weren't blank, weren't empty. They were filled with something else, pain, fear, but also defiance. A will to resist. The teacher followed Jason's gaze, and their smile faltered, a flash of anger crossing their face. They stepped toward the student, their movements sharp, aggressive, and the student flinched, their eyes widening in terror. "No," Jason whispered, but this time it wasn't directed at the teacher. It was for the student, for the small, fragile glimmer of hope that still existed in this place. He took a step forward, his heart pounding, his mind screaming at him to stop, to run, but he ignored it. He had to reach that student. He had to stop the teacher, stop whatever was happening in this room, before it consumed them all. The teacher turned to him, their eyes narrowing, their smile vanishing completely. "You cannot win," they hissed, their voice no longer smooth, but sharp, like the edge of a blade. "You cannot resist." But Jason was already moving, his legs carrying him forward, his body surging with adrenaline, with a fierce, burning need to protect, to save. The students around him tried to block his path, their twisted forms reaching out for him, but he pushed through them, his eyes locked on the small, defiant figure in the corner. The teacher moved to intercept him, their form shifting, becoming something darker, more monstrous, but Jason didn't stop. He couldn't. He reached the student, grabbing their hand, pulling them up, away from the desk, away from the dark, twisting power that had taken hold of them. The teacher let out a shriek of rage, the sound echoing through the room, and the darkness surged forward, wrapping around Jason, trying to drag him down, trying to pull him away. But he held on, his grip on the student's hand tightening, his mind focusing on that single point of light, that single point of defiance. And then, with a final, desperate effort, he yanked the student free, pulling them out of the chair, out of the darkness, and into the light. The room exploded with sound, with light, with a blinding, searing heat that burned away the shadows, the darkness, the twisted forms that had once been students. The teacher let out a final, agonized scream, their form disintegrating, collapsing in on itself, until there was nothing left but a faint, lingering whisper, quickly fading into silence. And then it was over. Jason collapsed to the floor, his chest heaving, his body trembling with exhaustion. The student fell beside him, their small bodies shaking with sobs, their hands still clutching his, holding on, as if their life depended on it. For a long moment, they just lay there, the silence of the room broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing, the faint, distant creak of the building settling around them. But they were alive. They had survived. And as Jason looked at the small, fragile figure beside him, he knew that, somehow, they had won. The silence that followed the teacher's final scream was like the calm after a storm, a stillness so profound it felt as if the world itself had stopped breathing. Jason lay on the cold floor, every muscle in his body trembling with exhaustion. The room around him was bathed in a faint, eerie light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, casting long, unnatural shadows that stretched across the walls. Beside him, the small student he had rescued was curled up, their body racked with silent sobs. Jason reached out, resting a hand on their shoulder, trying to offer some small comfort, but his mind was already drifting, pulled inexorably toward the dark revelation that had been gnawing at the edges of his thoughts since he had entered this cursed school. He sat up slowly, his body protesting with every movement, and glanced around the room. The desks were empty now, the grotesque figures that had once occupied them gone, as if they had never existed. The chalkboard at the front of the room was blank, the writing that had once covered it erased, leaving only faint, ghostly smudges behind. The air was still thick with the smell of decay, but it was fading, as if the darkness that had taken root in this place was slowly retreating. But Jason knew better. The darkness wasn't gone. It was still here, lurking in the walls, in the floor, in the very air they breathed. It was the school itself, an ancient, malevolent force that had taken root here long ago, feeding on the fears and souls of those who had the misfortune to cross its threshold. He turned his gaze to the student beside him, their small forms still trembling under his hand. They were the key, he realized, the last flicker of defiance, the last spark of resistance against the darkness. But why? What made this one different from the others? What had spared them from the twisted fate that had befallen their classmates? "Hey," Jason said softly, his voice rough from disuse. "Can you tell me your name?" The student sniffled, wiping their nose with the back of a trembling hand before looking up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. There was something familiar in those eyes, something that tugged at Jason's memory, but he couldn't quite place it. "My name is Evan," the student whispered, their voice barely audible, trembling with fear. I don't remember how I got here. I just remember. The teacher." Jason's heart skipped a beat at the name. Evan. The name he had seen carved into the desk in the detention room. The name that had stood out among all the others, the one that had seemed to call to him. A cold shiver ran down his spine as the pieces began to fall into place. "Evan," Jason repeated, his voice shaking as the realization hit him like a physical blow. "Evan, what do you remember about this school? About what happened here?" Evan shook their head, their small face scrunched up in confusion and fear. "I don't know," they whispered. "I just remember the teacher. And the voices. They told me to stay, to learn, but I didn't want to. I wanted to go home." Jason's breath caught in his throat as the full weight of the truth settled over him, heavy and suffocating. The school wasn't just a place, it was a living entity, a twisted, malevolent force that had been feeding on the souls of its students for decades, maybe longer. And Evan. Evan was its last victim, the final piece in its dark, insidious puzzle. He had seen it in the other students, the way their bodies had been twisted and corrupted by the school's influence, their minds shattered and hollowed out, leaving nothing but empty shells behind. But Evan had resisted. Somehow, against all odds, this small, fragile child had fought back, had refused to let the darkness take hold, and in doing so, they had become the school's greatest threat. "Evan," Jason said, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination, "we have to get out of here. We have to leave this place before it's too late." Evan looked up at him, their eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. "But how?" "The doors. They're all gone. The hallways. They keep changing." Jason swallowed hard, his mind racing. The school wasn't going to let them go easily. It had already shown him that it could warp reality, twist the very fabric of the building to suit its needs. But there had to be a way out, a way to break free from its grasp. He couldn't let Evan suffer the same fate as the others. He wouldn't. "We'll find a way," Jason said, his voice firmer now, more certain. "We have to. You're different, Evan. You're the key. You've resisted this place, and that's why it's afraid of you. That's why it's trying so hard to keep you here." Evan's eyes filled with tears, and they shook their head, their small hands clutching at Jason's shirt. "I don't want to be the key," they whispered, their voice filled with a child's desperate plea for safety. "I just want to go home." Jason's heart broke at the sound of it, and he pulled Evan into a tight embrace, holding them close as if he could shield them from the horrors that surrounded them. "I know," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I know, Evan. And I promise you we're going to get out of here. Together." As he held Evan, Jason's mind raced, searching for any clue, any memory that might lead them to safety. And then it came to him, a flash of understanding that sent a chill down his spine. The school was alive, yes, but it was also a construct, a creation that had been built on the memories, the fears, the souls of those who had been trapped here. It had power, but that power wasn't infinite. It was tied to the building, to the walls, to the very structure that had been twisted into something dark and terrible. If they could find the heart of it, the source of its power, they might be able to destroy it, or at the very least weaken it enough to escape. Jason pulled back from Evan, his hands resting on their small shoulders as he looked into their tear-streaked face. "Evan, I need you to be brave, okay? I think I know what we need to do, but I'm going to need your help." Evan sniffled, wiping their nose with the back of their hand, and nodded, their eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "Okay," they whispered, their voice trembling but strong. "I'll try." Jason smiled, though the gesture felt hollow in the face of the darkness that loomed around them. "That's all I can ask." He stood, pulling Evan to their feet, and together they turned to face the door at the back of the classroom. It stood slightly ajar, a faint light spilling through the crack, beckoning them forward. Jason knew, deep down, that whatever lay beyond that door would be the final test, the ultimate confrontation with the darkness that had taken hold of this place. But they had no choice. They had to face it, had to fight it, if they were going to have any chance of escaping. Jason took a deep breath, his hand tightening around Evan's, and together they stepped forward, leaving the classroom behind as they walked into the unknown. The school had revealed its true nature, its dark, insidious power laid bare. But Jason wasn't going to let it win. Not now, not ever. The hallway beyond the door was different from the rest of the school, brighter, cleaner, almost welcoming. The walls were painted a soft, warm yellow, and the floor was polished to a mirror-like shine, reflecting the overhead lights that glowed with a steady, reassuring light. For a moment Jason hesitated, wondering if they had somehow found a way out, but he knew better. The school had shown him too many of its tricks, too many of its lies, for him to believe this was anything more than another illusion. Evan's small hand gripped his tightly, their fingers trembling as they walked side by side down the pristine corridor. The silence was almost suffocating, a stark contrast to the chaotic noise and whispers that had filled the rest of the building. It was as if the school was holding its breath, waiting, watching, knowing that the end was near. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, the tension winding tighter and tighter with each step they took. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, the doors lining the walls identical, unmarked, each one a potential trap. But there was no turning back now. He could feel it. This was the final stretch, the last test the school would throw at them. They reached the end of the hallway, where a single door stood slightly ajar, a thin sliver of light spilling out into the corridor. Jason exchanged a glance with Evan, their eyes wide with fear and determination, and he nodded. There was no choice but to go forward. He pushed the door open, and they stepped inside. The room beyond was vast, cavernous, unlike anything Jason had seen in the school before. The ceiling stretched high above them, lost in shadow, while the walls seemed to curve inward, creating a sense of being inside something alive, something that breathed and pulsed with a dark, malevolent energy. At the far end of the room, a large, ornate bell hung from the ceiling, its surface tarnished and cracked, as if it had been there for centuries, waiting for this moment. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, undisturbed except for a single path that led straight to the bell. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he realized what it was. This was the heart of the school, the source of its power, and the bell. The bell was the key, the final bell that would ring out, sealing their fate once and for all. Evan's grip tightened on his hand, and Jason glanced down at the small, frightened face looking up at him. "What do we do?" Evan whispered, their voice trembling. Jason swallowed hard, his mind racing. The school had brought them here for a reason. It had guided them, manipulated them, all to reach this point. But why? What was the bell? What would happen if it rang? "We can't let it ring," Jason said, his voice low, steadying himself as he spoke. "If that bell rings, it's over. The school wins. We can't let that happen." Evan nodded, their eyes wide with understanding, and together they stepped forward, their feet sinking into the thick dust as they approached the bell. The air grew colder, the light dimming as they neared it, and Jason could feel the weight of the school's malevolent presence pressing down on them, urging them to stop, to turn back, to give up. But they kept going. The bell loomed above them, massive and imposing, its surface etched with strange symbols that seemed to shift and change as Jason looked at them. He reached out a hand, hesitating only for a moment before placing it on the bell's surface. The metal was cold, unnaturally so, and it sent a shiver through him, as if the bell itself was alive, aware of his touch. "Now what?" Evan asked, their voice barely more than a whisper. Jason opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble, a low, rumbling vibration that sent cracked spider-webbing through the dusty floor. The air grew thick with the scent of smoke and burning metal, and a deep, resonant hum filled the room, emanating from the bell itself. The bell was waking up. "No," Jason shouted, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. He looked around frantically, searching for something, anything, that could stop it, but there was nothing, just the bell, the room, and the endless darkness beyond. The hum grew louder, more intense, the vibrations shaking the ground beneath them, and Jason could feel the darkness closing in, the malevolent force of the school converging on them, ready to claim them once and for all. The final bell was about to ring, and when it did, there would be no escape. "Evan," Jason cried, grabbing the child by the shoulders, forcing them to look at him. "We have to destroy it. We have to stop it from ringing." "But how?" Evan's voice was shrill with panic, their eyes wide with terror. Jason didn't have an answer. He could feel the darkness pressing in on him, suffocating him, draining his strength, his will to fight. The bell was vibrating now, a deep, resonant tone that reverberated through his bones, shaking him to his core. He could see the cracks in the floor widening, the walls buckling as the room itself seemed to distort, bending around them as if the school was trying to crush them in its grasp. He looked up at the bell, the massive, ancient bell that held the power of the school within it, and knew what he had to do. "Get back," Jason ordered, pushing Evan away from the bell toward the far wall. "Get back and don't look." Evan stumbled backward, their small bodies shaking with fear, but they didn't argue. They ran to the far side of the room, huddling against the wall, their eyes wide with terror. Jason turned back to the bell, the dark metal vibrating so violently now that he could barely keep his hand on it. He could feel the power within it, the dark, malevolent energy that had trapped so many souls within the walls of the school, that had twisted and corrupted everything it touched. He had to destroy it. He had to end this, once and for all. He took a deep breath, bracing himself for what he knew would be the final, desperate act. The bell was waking up, ready to ring out its final note, but Jason wasn't going to let it. He would stop it, even if it cost him everything. With a shout that was equal parts defiance and terror, Jason pulled back his arm and slammed his fist into the side of the bell with all his strength. The impact sent a shockwave through his body, pain lancing up his arm, but he didn't stop. He struck it again, and again, each blow more desperate, more forceful than the last. The bell shuddered under his assault, the vibrations growing wilder, more chaotic, as if it was struggling to maintain its control. Jason could feel the metal beginning to give, the surface cracking under the force of his blows, but it wasn't enough. The bell was still vibrating, still humming, still ready to ring out and seal their fate. "Come on," Jason shouted, his voice hoarse, his vision blurring with tears of pain and desperation. "Come on, you son of a bitch. Break." With one final, desperate scream, Jason slammed his fist into the bell, putting every ounce of his strength, every last shred of his will into the blow. The metal buckled under his hand, a deafening crack echoing through the room as the surface shattered, splintering into 1,000 pieces. The vibration stopped. The hum ceased. The air was suddenly still, deathly quiet. Jason staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body trembling with exhaustion and pain. The bell hung before him, shattered and broken, its surface split open like the shell of a dead insect. The room around them was silent, the darkness that had pressed in on them now retreating, pulling back like a tide that had lost its momentum. It was over. They had won. Evan ran to his side, their small hands clutching at his arm, their eyes wide with fear and relief. "Jason, did we do it? Is it over?" Jason nodded, too exhausted to speak, too overwhelmed by the sudden, profound sense of relief that was washing over him. He had destroyed the bell. He had broken the heart of the school. The final bell would never ring. But even as he stood there, breathing in the still, quiet air, a dark, unsettling thought crept into his mind. The school was alive, yes, but it was more than that. It was ancient, powerful, and malevolent beyond anything he could comprehend. And even though he had destroyed the bell, even though he had shattered the source of its power, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The darkness was retreating, yes, but it wasn't gone. It was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting, and it would be back. Jason barely had time to register the fleeting moment of triumph before the darkness surged back, more ferocious and desperate than ever. The shattered pieces of the bell seemed to tremble, vibrating with a low, ominous hum that reverberated through the vast chamber. The air thickened, growing cold and oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was being sucked into a void. Jason's heart skipped a beat as he realized that whatever force had been bound within the bell wasn't gone. It was free, unleashed, and now it was angry. "Run," Jason shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He grabbed Evan's hand and yanked the child toward the door, every instinct screaming that they had to get out, now. The room around them twisted, the walls seeming to stretch and distort, bending inward as if the entire space was being swallowed by the dark force they had just unleashed. The floor buckled under their feet, throwing them off balance, and the distant creaking of the building's foundations echoed like the groan of a dying beast. Jason tightened his grip on Evan's hand, his mind racing as he dragged them toward the exit. The shadows on the walls grew darker, denser, swirling together like a living entity, closing in on them with every step. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a force, a presence, malevolent and hungry, and it was coming for them. The door was only a few steps away, but it felt like miles. Jason's lungs burned with the effort of running, his muscles screaming in protest. But he couldn't stop, couldn't slow down. Not now, not when they were so close. "Don't look back," Jason yelled, more to himself than to Evan. He could feel the darkness nipping at his heels, a cold, creeping sensation that sent shivers down his spine. The shadows seemed to reach out, tendrils of black mist that curled and twisted like fingers, trying to grab hold of them, to pull them back into the abyss. They burst through the door, the force of their momentum nearly sending them sprawling, and stumbled into the hallway beyond. The bright, clean walls that had once seemed so inviting were now smeared with creeping shadows, the darkness seeping through the cracks in the floor, and the walls like a living thing, spreading its tendrils further and further and further, trying to engulf them. Jason didn't stop. He couldn't. He pulled Evan along, his feet pounding against the floor as they ran down the corridor, the darkness closing in behind them like a tidal wave. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, the exit always just out of reach, the walls bending and warping as the school tried to trap them, to twist reality around them. The lights overhead flickered, one by one, winking out as they passed, leaving them running through a tunnel of darkness. Jason could feel the force behind them growing stronger, more insistent, a relentless pursuit that he knew he couldn't outrun forever. Evan stumbled beside him, their breath coming in short, panicked gasps, but they didn't let go of his hand. "Jason, what's happening?" they cried, their voice trembling with fear. "It's the school," Jason panted, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and terror. "It's trying to stop us. We have to keep going." But the hallway was changing, the walls closing in, the space narrowing with every step they took. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he realized they were being funneled, herded towards something, some final trap that the school had set for them. He glanced over his shoulder, and his blood ran cold. The darkness was no longer just shadows, it had taken form, a massive, writhing mass of black mist and twisting shapes that defied logic and reason. It moved with a purpose, with intent, closing in on them with terrifying speed, its tendrils reaching out, eager to claim them. Jason's mind raced, searching for a way out, but the hallway offered no escape, no doors, no windows, just an endless stretch of narrowing space that seemed to pulse with the malevolent energy of the school itself. The force behind them was relentless, an inevitable doom that he could feel pressing down on him, a weight that threatened to crush him under its sheer, overwhelming power. "No," Jason muttered under his breath, his grip on Evan's hand tightening as he pushed himself to run faster, harder. "No, we're not going to let it win." But even as he said the words, he knew the truth. The darkness was closing in, and they were running out of time. The walls around them began to shudder, the floor tilting and shifting beneath their feet as if the very building was coming apart at the seams. The sound of creaking wood and crumbling stone echoed through the hallway, and Jason could feel the ground beginning to give way, the floorboards splintering under the pressure. "Jason," Evan screamed, their voice filled with pure, unfiltered terror. Jason didn't need to look to know what was happening. The darkness was overtaking them, swallowing the hallway behind them, consuming everything in its path. The exit was nowhere in sight, the hallway now a twisted, nightmarish landscape that seemed to stretch on into infinity, a maze with no way out. His breath came in ragged gasps, his vision blurred with exhaustion, but he forced himself to keep going. He had to. For Evan, for himself, he couldn't let the school win. Not now, not after everything they had been through. But the darkness was faster, stronger, and it was gaining on them. Jason could feel it at his back, the cold, creeping tendrils of black mist wrapping around his ankles, pulling him back, dragging him down. He stumbled, his foot catching on a jagged piece of floorboard, and he went down hard, his hand slipping from Evan's grasp as he hit the ground. Jason Evans' voice was a distant echo, distorted by the swirling shadows, the darkness that was now all around him. Jason tried to push himself up, tried to get back to his feet, but the darkness was too strong, too overwhelming. It wrapped around him, pulling him down, suffocating him, its cold tendrils seeping into his skin, into his mind, pulling him into the void. No, Jason gasped, struggling against the force that was dragging him under. He could see Evan just ahead, their small figure silhouetted against the last vestiges of light, but the darkness was between them now, a solid wall of black mist that he couldn't break through. Evan turned, their eyes wide with terror. But there was nothing they could do, nothing Jason could do. The darkness was pulling him away, pulling him under, dragging him back into the heart of the school, where it would consume him, twist him, turn him into another one of its lost, hollow souls. "Run, Evan," Jason choked out, his voice barely more than a whisper as the darkness closed in around him, the light fading, his vision going black. "Run, don't look back." But before Evan could move, before Jason could make another desperate attempt to escape, the darkness surged forward, a massive, writhing wave that swallowed everything in its path. And then there was nothing. Darkness enveloped Jason, a suffocating blanket that pressed in from all sides, draining the warmth from his body, the air from his lungs. It was as though the school had swallowed him whole, pulling him into a void where time and space had no meaning. His thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm, torn apart by the relentless pull of the blackness that surrounded him. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, disconnected, as if they no longer belonged to him. He wasn't sure how long he had been drifting in that abyss, whether it had been seconds or hours, but gradually, a sensation began to creep back into his awareness. A faint, distant glow, so weak it was almost imperceptible. It was like the flicker of a dying flame in the deepest night, a tiny spark of light that refused to be extinguished. Jason latched onto it, focusing all his will, all his energy, on that single point of light, fighting against the pull of the darkness. The light grew stronger, inch by agonizing inch, until it became a thin, narrow beam piercing through the black. Jason reached out toward it, his fingers brushing against something solid, cold, rough, but real. With a surge of effort, he pulled himself toward it, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the light grew brighter, more tangible. He could feel the darkness resisting, pulling at him with invisible hands, but he pushed back, straining against the weight that threatened to drag him back into the void. And then, with one final desperate lunge, he broke free. Jason stumbled forward, collapsing onto cold, hard ground. His chest heaved with the effort of breathing, each inhalation burning in his lungs as if he were surfacing from deep underwater. The light around him was harsh, blinding after the suffocating blackness, and he squinted against it, his vision swimming as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. He was in a long, narrow corridor, the walls lined with old, cracked tiles that gleamed dully in the pale light. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic and sharp that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The floor beneath him was slick, sticky, and he didn't need to look down to know what it was. The sense of dread that had been building inside him intensified, clawing at his insides as he forced himself to stand. The corridor stretched on ahead of him, a narrow, oppressive tunnel with no visible end. The light came from a single, flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling, its weak, intermittent glow casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. Jason took a step forward, his foot slipping slightly on the slick surface, and he steadied himself against the wall, his hand coming away damp and cold. He had to keep moving. He had to find Evan. The memory of the darkness, of that final, desperate moment when it had pulled him under, was still fresh in his mind, but he couldn't let it paralyze him. He had to believe that Evan was still out there, still fighting, still alive. The school hadn't won. Not yet. Jason forced himself to walk, one slow, deliberate step after another, his eyes fixed on the flickering light ahead. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, an endless tunnel that wound deeper and deeper into the heart of the school, but he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. He rounded a corner, and the corridor opened up into a large, open space. The ceiling here was high, vaulted, the walls lined with tall, narrow windows that let in faint beams of pale moonlight. The room was empty, silent, but there was something about it, something that made Jason's skin prickle with unease. At the far end of the room, almost hidden in the shadows, was a door. It was large, imposing, made of heavy, dark wood with thick iron bands running across it. The door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of light spilling out from the crack, and Jason's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The exit. The way out. But as he took a step forward, something moved in the shadows. Jason froze, his breath catching in his throat as a figure stepped into the faint light, blocking the path to the door. It was tall, thin, its form draped in long, dark robes that fluttered slightly in an unseen breeze. The figure's face was hidden in the shadows of a deep hood, but Jason could feel its eyes on him, a cold, piercing gaze that sent a shiver down his spine. The figure raised a hand, and the door behind it creaked open a little further, the light growing brighter, more inviting. Jason could feel the pull of it, the promise of safety, of escape, but he knew that the figure wasn't going to let him pass. Not without a fight. "You've come far," the figure said, its voice low, smooth, but with an edge of something dark and cruel. "But this is where it ends." Jason swallowed hard, his mind racing. The figure was blocking the only way out, the only chance he had of escaping this nightmare. But he couldn't back down. He couldn't give up. Not now. He took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides, and the figure tilted its head slightly, as if amused by the gesture. "You think you can fight me," the figure said, a hint of mockery in its voice. "You think you can escape?" Jason didn't respond. He couldn't. All he could do was take another step forward, his eyes locked on the door behind the figure, his mind focused on one thing, getting through it, reaching the light, finding Evan. The figure's hand moved again, a slow, deliberate gesture, and the shadows around the room seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing like living things. Jason could feel the darkness pressing in on him, the same suffocating blackness that had nearly swallowed him whole, but he pushed it back, his will a fragile but unyielding barrier against the tide. The figure stepped aside just slightly, just enough to give Jason a clear view of the door. The light spilling out from the crack was brighter now, almost blinding, and Jason could feel its warmth, its promise of safety and escape. But he knew it was a trap. He could see it in the way the figure moved, the way the shadows seemed to pulse with anticipation. The exit was right there, within reach, but the figure was waiting, watching, ready to strike the moment he let his guard down. Jason took a deep breath, steeling himself. He had no choice. He had to go through that door, no matter what it cost him. He couldn't let the school win. He couldn't let the school win. He couldn't leave Evan behind. With a sudden burst of energy, Jason lunged forward, his body moving on pure instinct. The figure's hand shot out, a tendril of darkness lashing toward him, but Jason was faster. He dodged to the side, the tendril grazing his arm, sending a shock of cold pain through his body. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The door was right there, just a few feet away. The light was so bright, so warm, it was almost blinding. Jason could feel the pull of it, the promise of freedom, of escape, but he also felt the darkness, the cold, creeping tendrils of fear and doubt that threatened to drag him back. The figure moved again, faster this time, the shadows around it coiling and twisting like serpents, ready to strike. Jason could feel the darkness closing in, could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, but he forced himself forward, his hand reaching out for the door, for the light. He felt the cold, clawed hand of the figure brush against his back, felt the darkness wrapping around him, pulling him back. But he didn't stop. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Jason threw himself toward the door, his hand slamming against the wood, pushing it open. Light flooded the room, bright and overwhelming, burning away the shadows, the darkness, the figure, everything. Jason felt a rush of warmth, of relief, as the light engulfed him, pulling him through the door, into the blinding, brilliant light beyond. And then, just as suddenly, it was over. Jason stumbled forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body trembling with exhaustion. The light was gone, replaced by a soft, warm glow that filled the room around him. He looked up, blinking against the sudden brightness, and realized that he was outside. The sky above him was clear, the stars twinkling in the deep blue night, and the air was cool and fresh, free of the stifling, oppressive weight of the school. Jason took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the sweet, clean air, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt alive. But then he remembered. Evan, he called, spinning around, his eyes scanning the empty field that stretched out before him. "Evan, where are you?" There was no answer, just the soft rustle of the wind through the grass, the distant chirping of crickets. The school was gone, the darkness was gone, but so was Evan. Jason's heart sank, a cold, heavy weight settling in his chest. He had made it out, but he had lost Evan. He had failed. But then, in the distance, he saw it, a small figure, standing at the edge of the field, silhouetted against the pale light of the moon. "Evan," Jason called again, his voice breaking with relief. The figure turned, and even from a distance, Jason could see the small, familiar face, the wide, tear-filled eyes. Evan was alive. Evan had made it out. Jason ran toward them, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and joy, the darkness that had haunted him for so long finally lifting. He had made it out. They had both made it out. But as he reached Evan, as he wrapped the child in a tight, protective embrace, a single, dark thought flickered at the edge of his mind. The school was gone. The darkness was gone. But the fight wasn't over yet. The night air was cool and crisp, the scent of damp earth and dew-laden grass filling Jason's lungs as he held Evan close, the small child trembling against him. The stars above seemed to shimmer more brightly than before, their light unmarred by the oppressive darkness that had gripped them for so long. For a moment the world was quiet, peaceful, as if the horrors they had just endured were nothing more than a distant nightmare. But the stillness felt fragile, like the silence that follows a storm, beautiful, but charged with the knowledge that it could be shattered at any moment. Jason gently pulled back from Evan, his hands resting on the child's shoulders as he looked down into their tear-streaked face. There was something in Evan's eyes that hadn't been there before, an awareness, a wisdom that no child should possess. It was as if the darkness they had escaped had left its mark, a shadow that lingered just beneath the surface. "Are you okay?" Jason asked softly, his voice rough with exhaustion. Evan nodded slowly, their eyes wide and unblinking, as if they were still trying to make sense of everything that had happened. "We made it out," they whispered, the words trembling on their lips, as if they could hardly believe them. "Yeah," Jason replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We made it out." But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't entirely true. Yes, they had escaped the school, escaped the darkness that had threatened to consume them, but something was still off, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The field they stood in, the stars above, it all felt real, but it also felt wrong, as if the world around them had been subtly altered, twisted in ways that defied understanding. He glanced back over his shoulder, half expecting to see the school looming behind them, but there was nothing there, just an empty expanse of grass and trees, the landscape bathed in the soft glow of the moon. The school was gone, the darkness vanquished, but the unease in Jason's chest refused to fade. "Come on," he said, gently tugging on Evan's hand. "We need to get out of here. Find some help." Evan nodded again, still silent, and together they began to walk, their steps slow and unsteady as they moved away from the field, away from the place that had nearly destroyed them. The grass was wet with dew, the earth soft beneath their feet, and Jason could feel the cool night air brushing against his skin, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the school's interior. But the further they walked, the more Jason's unease grew. The landscape around them didn't change, just an endless expanse of grass and trees, the same stretch of land repeating over and over again, as if they were walking in circles, trapped in some endless loop. His heart began to pound, a cold sweat breaking out on his skin as the realization set in. They hadn't escaped. Not really. The school, the darkness, it was still with them, still surrounding them, even out here in the open. It was like a shadow that clung to their heels, a dark presence that refused to let go. Jason stopped, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps as he turned to Evan, his eyes wide with fear. "Evan, we're not really out, are we?" Evan's gaze was distant, their face pale and drawn. They didn't answer, but the look in their eyes was enough to confirm what Jason already knew. "No," Jason whispered, his voice trembling. "No, this can't be happening." But it was. The truth of it settled over him like a leaden weight, dragging him down into the depths of despair. They had fought so hard, come so close to escaping, but in the end, it had all been for nothing. The darkness had followed them, had taken root in the world around them, warping reality in ways that Jason couldn't begin to comprehend. He felt a surge of anger, of frustration, welling up inside him, an overwhelming need to fight back, to rage against the unfairness of it all. But there was nothing left to fight, nothing left to rage against. The enemy was gone, but its influence remained, lingering like a dark stain on their souls. Evan looked up at him, their small face filled with a mixture of fear and sorrow. "What do we do now?" they asked, their voice barely more than a whisper. Jason didn't have an answer. He could feel the darkness creeping closer, the world around them growing colder, more alien with every passing second. The stars above seemed to flicker, their light dimming, as if the night itself was being swallowed by the void. "We keep going," Jason said finally, his voice hollow but resolute. "We keep moving. We don't stop." Evan nodded, their hand tightening around his, and together they began to walk again, their steps slow and deliberate. The landscape around them remained unchanged, the endless field stretching out before them like a prison with no walls, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. As they walked, the darkness pressed in closer, the night growing colder, the air heavier with each breath they took. Jason could feel it now, the presence of the school, the malevolent force that had once been confined within its walls, now free to roam the world beyond. It was like a living entity, a shadow that clung to their heels, whispering in the back of his mind, reminding him that they would never truly escape. But they kept going. The night stretched on, the darkness deepening, but Jason refused to give in. He could feel the fear gnawing at the edges of his resolve, could feel the despair threatening to overwhelm him, but he pushed it back, holding on to the one thing that still mattered, the promise he had made to Evan. The promise to keep them safe, to protect them from the darkness, no matter what. As they walked, the landscape began to change, subtly at first, but then more noticeably. The trees grew taller, their branches twisting and curling like gnarled fingers, the grass beneath their feet growing darker, thicker, until it felt more like wading through water than walking on solid ground. The stars above flickered out one by one, leaving only the pale light of the moon to guide their way. Jason's breath came in short, ragged gasps, his body trembling with exhaustion, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The darkness was still there, still following them, But there was something else now, something new. A faint glimmer of light on the horizon, barely visible through the thickening fog that had begun to creep in around them. He quickened his pace, pulling Evan along with him, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. The light grew stronger as they approached, cutting through the fog like a beacon, guiding them forward. Jason could feel the darkness pulling back, retreating, as if afraid of what lay ahead. The ground beneath their feet began to solidify, the thick, swamp-like grass giving way to hard-packed earth. The air grew warmer, the scent of damp earth replaced by the faint, sweet fragrance of wildflowers. The light on the horizon grew brighter, more defined, until Jason could make out the outline of a structure, small, unassuming, but filled with a warmth that beckoned them closer. As they approached, Jason's heart lifted, the weight of the darkness beginning to lift from his shoulders. The structure was a small cottage, its windows glowing with a soft, welcoming light, the scent of fresh bread and herbs wafting through the open door. It felt like a dream, too perfect to be real, but Jason didn't care. He needed this. Evan needed this. They reached the door, and Jason hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the worn wooden handle. He could still feel the darkness lingering at the edges of his mind, a shadow that refused to be fully banished, but the warmth of the light was too strong, too inviting to resist. He pushed the door open, and they stepped inside. The warmth of the room enveloped them like a comforting embrace, the light soft and golden, casting gentle shadows on the walls. The air was filled with the scent of home-cooked food, of warmth and safety, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jason allowed himself to relax. Evan looked up at him, their eyes wide with wonder, and Jason smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached all the way to his eyes. They were safe. They had found a way out. But as he closed the door behind them, sealing off the darkness that lurked outside, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. The darkness was still out there, still waiting, still hungry. It had let them go this time, but it hadn't been defeated. Not entirely. And as Jason looked around the cozy, inviting room, his heart filled with both hope and dread, he knew one thing for certain. The darkness would be back. But next time he would be ready.